I still remember the taste of that morning. Stale oatmeal and powdered milk, the same breakfast I'd eaten for 17 years at St. Catherine's Home for Children. But that Tuesday in March felt different, because I knew it would be my last meal there. I was turning 18 in 3 days, and the state had made it clear. When you age out, you're on your own. No exceptions, no extensions. I'd packed my belongings the night before. Everything I owned fit into a single duffel bag. 2 pairs of jeans, some t-shirts, a winter coat with a broken zipper, and a small wooden box containing the only item from my past. A faded photograph of a woman I'd been told was my mother. She'd left me at the orphanage when I was 6 months old. No note, no explanation, just a baby in a basket and that single photograph tucked into my blanket. Mrs. Brennan, the director, called me into her office after breakfast. She was a stern woman, with grey hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch her face, but I'd seen glimpses of kindness in her over the years. She handed me an envelope containing $200, a list of homeless shelters, and information about job placement services. Her expression was practiced, sympathetic but detached. She'd done this dozens of times before. "You're a smart boy, Danny," she said, her voice carrying that tone adults use when they're trying to be encouraging but don't quite believe their own words. "Keep your head down, work hard, and you'll figure things out." I nodded, thanked her, and walked toward the door, expecting to step out into the streets of Chicago with nothing but hope and $200 to my name. But as my hand touched the doorknob, Mrs. Brennan cleared her throat. "Wait," she said, sounding almost uncertain. "There's something else." She pulled open a drawer in her desk and removed a yellowed manila folder with my name written across the top in faded ink. "This arrived years ago," she explained, sliding the folder across the desk toward me. "We tried to follow up, but the communication went nowhere. With everything that happened, we simply filed it away. I honestly forgot about it until yesterday when I was processing your exit paperwork." My heart thudded as I opened the folder. Inside were legal documents, letters with official stamps, and a handwritten note on lined paper. The handwriting was shaky, like it had been written by someone elderly or sick. The note was addressed to me. "Danny," it began, "if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you've reached adulthood. I'm your grandfather, Thomas Miller. Your mother was my daughter, Sarah. She made mistakes, son, mistakes that broke all our hearts. But you were never one of them. I wanted to find you years ago, but by the time I learned where you were, I was too ill to travel, and the courts moved slower than molasses. I'm leaving you something, boy. It's not much by most people's standards, but it's honest work and good land. The farm has been in our family since 1947. It's yours now if you want it. The address is enclosed. A lawyer named Patterson in a town called Milbrook will have the keys and the papers. I hope you come, Danny. I hope you see what your family built, and I hope you understand that you were never unwanted. You were just lost for a while." I read the letter 3 times, barely breathing. A grandfather, a farm, a family I'd never known existed. Mrs. Brennan watched me with something close to genuine emotion. "The property is about 2 hours south of here," she said quietly. "Small town, rural area. It's been sitting empty for almost 2 years since he passed. The state tried to contact you through us, but with you being a minor and in our care, the paperwork got tangled up in red tape. Legally, it's yours now." I stared at the address written at the bottom of the letter. Milbrook, Illinois, Route 47, Miller Farm. It felt surreal, like a door had opened in a wall I'd always believed was solid. I wasn't going to the streets. I was going to a place that belonged to me. A place that had my name, my blood, woven into its soil. I left St. Catherine's that afternoon, with the folder clutched under my arm, and a Greyhound bus ticket purchased with half of my $200. The bus smelled like disinfectant and old vinyl, and the passengers were a mix of weary travelers and people who looked like they were running from something. I sat by the window, watching Chicago's skyline shrink behind me as we rolled south through flat farmland and scattered towns. My mind raced with questions. What did a farm even look like up close? What would I do with it? Did I even want it, or would I sell it and take the money to start fresh somewhere else? As the bus pulled into Milbrook 2 hours later, the sun was beginning to set, casting everything in warm, amber light. The town was small, just a main street with a few shops, a diner, a post office, and a gas station. There were American flags hanging from porches and flower boxes beneath windows. It looked like the kind of place you see in old movies, quiet and slow, where everyone knows everyone. I asked the bus driver where I could find Patterson Law Office, and he pointed down the street. "Third building on the left, son. Can't miss it." I thanked him, grabbed my duffel bag, and stepped off the bus into a world that felt nothing like the one I'd known. The air smelled different here, clean, earthy, alive. I walked down the sidewalk, my heart pounding with each step, and pushed open the door to the law office. A small bell chimed overhead. An older man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses looked up from his desk. "Can I help you?" he asked. I swallowed hard and held up the folder. "My name is Danny Miller," I said. "I'm here about my grandfather's farm." Mr. Patterson stood up slowly, his eyes widening with something that looked like relief, mixed with surprise. "Danny Miller," he repeated, as if testing the name on his tongue. "I'll be damned. We'd almost given up hope you'd come." He gestured for me to sit in one of the worn leather chairs across from his desk, then shuffled through a filing cabinet until he pulled out a thick folder with my grandfather's name embossed on the tab. "Your grandfather was a good man," Patterson said, settling back into his chair with a soft grunt. "Kept to himself mostly, but he was fair and honest. When he got sick, he made sure everything was in order. He talked about you, said he had a grandson out there somewhere, and that if God was willing, you'd find your way here eventually." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. Patterson slid several documents across the desk: deeds, tax records, and a letter of transfer. "The farm is 63 acres, he explained. "The house needs work. I won't lie to you. It's been sitting empty since Thomas passed 2 years ago. There's a barn, some outbuildings and equipment, though I can't say what condition any of it's in. The property taxes are current through the end of this year, and there's a small account set up to cover utilities for another 6 months. After that, you're on your own." I stared at the papers, my hands trembling slightly. This was real. A house, land, a legacy I'd never imagined having. "Can I see it?" I asked. Patterson smiled, a warm, genuine expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "I was hoping you'd ask. I'll drive you out there myself. It's about 15 minutes from town." We climbed into his old pickup truck, the kind with a bench seat and a manual transmission that groaned with every gear change. As we drove through Milbrook and out onto a narrow 2-lane road, Patterson filled the silence with stories about my grandfather. How he'd served in the Korean War, came home and bought the farm with his military savings. How he'd raised my mother alone after my grandmother died young. "Sarah was a bright girl," Patterson said carefully, his tone shifting. "But she got mixed up with the wrong crowd in her 20s. Drugs, bad relationships, broke your grandfather's heart. When she disappeared, he spent years trying to find her. By the time he learned about you, the state had already placed you in the system, and he was too sick to fight through all the legal barriers." The weight of that truth settled over me like a heavy blanket. My grandfather had wanted me. He'd tried, and I'd spent my whole childhood thinking I was nobody's. We turned onto a gravel driveway marked by a weathered wooden sign that read, "Miller Farm," in faded paint. The truck bounced over ruts and potholes as we drove beneath a canopy of oak trees, their branches forming a tunnel that opened suddenly into a clearing. And there it was. The farmhouse stood at the center of the property, a 2-story structure with white paint peeling like sunburned skin. The porch sagged slightly on one side, and several windows were cracked or boarded up. But despite its condition, there was something solid about it, something enduring. Behind the house stood a large red barn, its roof dotted with missing shingles, and beyond that stretched fields of overgrown grass and wildflowers swaying in the evening breeze. Patterson parked the truck and handed me a set of keys. "It's yours, son," he said quietly. "What you do with it is up to you." I stepped out of the truck and walked slowly toward the house, my boots crunching on the gravel. The air smelled like earth and rain, and something else I couldn't quite name, something old and forgotten. I climbed the porch steps carefully, testing each board before putting my full weight on it. The front door was unlocked. It creaked open, releasing a gust of stale air that smelled like dust and time. The interior was dim, lit only by the fading sunlight filtering through dirty windows. I stepped inside and found myself in a small living room. Furniture sat covered with sheets and photographs hung crookedly on the walls. I moved closer to one of them and felt my breath catch. It was a picture of a young woman holding a baby. The woman had my eyes, the same shape, the same color, and the baby, wrapped in a pale blue blanket, had to be me. This was my mother, and this was the last place she'd called home before everything fell apart. I walked through the house slowly, room by room. The kitchen had an old gas stove and a table with 2 chairs. Upstairs, there were 3 bedrooms, one clearly my grandfather's, one that must have been my mother's, and a smaller one filled with boxes. I opened one of the boxes and found children's books, a baseball glove, and a stuffed bear with one button eye missing. Things he'd saved, things he'd hoped to give me someday. I sat down on the floor of that small bedroom, surrounded by the remnants of a life I'd never known, and for the first time in years, I let myself cry. Not out of sadness, but out of something deeper. Relief, belonging, the feeling that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as alone as I'd always believed. Patterson found me there 20 minutes later. He didn't say anything, just placed a hand on my shoulder and waited. When I finally stood up, he handed me a business card. "You need anything, you call me," he said. "There are people in town who knew your grandfather. Good people. They'll help if you ask." I thanked him, and he drove back to town, leaving me alone on the farm as darkness settled over the land. I walked outside and sat on the porch steps, staring up at a sky filled with more stars than I'd ever seen in the city. The night was alive with sounds, crickets, distant owls, the rustle of wind through the trees. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. If you've made it this far, I'd love to hear from you. Hit that subscribe button and join this community, because stories like these deserve to be shared. And drop a comment below. Tell me, have you ever discovered something about your past that completely changed how you saw your future? Let's talk about it. I woke up the next morning to sunlight streaming through a cracked window and the sound of birds I couldn't identify singing outside. For a moment, I forgot where I was, and then it all came rushing back. The orphanage, the letter, the farm. I was lying on a dusty couch in my grandfather's living room, using my jacket as a blanket. My neck ached from the awkward angle, but I didn't care. I'd slept better than I had in months, maybe years. I stood up, stretched, and walked into the kitchen. The faucet sputtered and coughed when I turned it on, spitting out brown water before finally running clear. I splashed some on my face, the coldness shocking me fully awake. My stomach growled, reminding me that I hadn't eaten since the bus station yesterday. I had about $90 left and no idea what I was going to do for food or work. But those were problems for later. Right now, I wanted to explore. I stepped outside into the crisp morning air and looked around with fresh eyes. In daylight, the farm looked both better and worse than it had last night. The bones were good, the structures were still standing, but everything was covered in a layer of neglect. Weeds choked the pathways, paint peeled from every surface, and rust claimed anything metal. I walked toward the barn first, its massive doors hanging slightly askew on their hinges. I pulled one open, and it groaned in protest, scraping against the dirt floor. Inside, the barn was cavernous and dim, shafts of sunlight piercing through gaps in the roof and illuminating floating dust particles. Old farm equipment sat scattered around, a tractor with flat tires, a plow, various tools hanging from the walls. Everything looked ancient, like artifacts from another era. Against the far wall, I noticed a workbench covered with a tarp. Curiosity pulled me toward it, and I lifted the canvas, sending up a cloud of dust that made me cough. Beneath it were more tools, carefully organized, and a small wooden box sitting in the center. The box was simple, made of dark wood with brass corners and a small latch. I opened it and found it filled with papers, receipts, maintenance logs, and photographs. Most of the photos showed my grandfather working the land, driving the tractor, standing proudly beside harvested crops. But one photo was different. It showed my grandfather standing next to a younger woman, his arm around her shoulders. She was smiling, genuinely happy, and she was clearly pregnant. On the back, written in the same shaky handwriting as the letter I'd received, were the words, "Sarah, 6 months along. Best day of my life." I stared at that photo for a long time, trying to connect this smiling, hopeful woman with the troubled person Patterson had described. What had happened to her? What had gone so wrong that she'd ended up leaving me at an orphanage and disappearing? I tucked the photo into my pocket and continued searching through the box. At the bottom, beneath all the papers, I found an old leather journal. The cover was worn smooth, and the pages were yellowed with age. I opened it carefully and saw my grandfather's handwriting filling every page. It was a farm journal, records of plantings and harvests, weather patterns and repairs. But scattered throughout were personal entries, thoughts and observations that revealed the man behind the farmer. One entry, dated 3 years ago, caught my attention. "Got word today that Sarah's boy is in Chicago. They won't let me see him. Say I need to go through courts and lawyers. I'm too tired for all that, too sick. But I'm leaving him everything, the farm, the land, all of it. Maybe he'll come when I'm gone. Maybe he'll understand that this place was always meant to be his. A man needs roots, needs to know where he comes from. I failed Sarah, but maybe I can still give her boy a fighting chance." Reading those words hit me harder than I expected. He'd known about me. He'd wanted to reach me. And even though we'd never met, he'd cared enough to leave me everything he had. I closed the journal and held it against my chest, feeling the weight of his hope pressing into me. I spent the rest of that morning exploring the property. I walked the fence lines, discovering where posts had rotted and wire had rusted through. I checked the other outbuildings, a chicken coop that hadn't housed chickens in years, a tool shed with a caved-in roof, and a small greenhouse with most of its glass panels shattered. The work ahead of me was enormous, maybe impossible. I had no farming experience, limited money, and no real plan. But I also had something I'd never had before, a place that was mine, a history that belonged to me, and a purpose that felt real for the first time in my life. Around noon, I heard a vehicle coming up the drive. I walked around the house and saw an old blue pickup truck parking near the porch. A man in his 50s climbed out, wearing work boots, jeans, and a flannel shirt. He had a weathered face and kind eyes that reminded me a little of my grandfather's photos. "You must be Danny," he called out, extending his hand as he approached. "I'm Martin Hayes. I own the farm adjacent to this one, been neighbors with your grandfather for 32 years. I shook his hand, surprised by the firmness of his grip. "Nice to meet you, sir." "Patterson called me last night, said Thomas's grandson had finally shown up. Figured you might need some help getting settled." He gestured toward the bed of his truck, which was loaded with boxes and bags. "Brought you some supplies, food, basic tools, things like that. And my wife, Linda, sent over a casserole. She insists nobody should spend their first days in a new home eating gas station sandwiches." I felt a lump form in my throat. This stranger was helping me simply because I was my grandfather's family. "I don't know what to say. Thank you." Martin waved off my gratitude. "Your grandfather helped me more times than I can count over the years. This is just paying it forward. Besides, us farmers look out for each other. That's how it works out here." We unloaded the truck together, carrying boxes into the kitchen and stacking them on the counter. Martin pointed out what everything was: canned goods, bread, eggs, milk, coffee, and a few basic tools I'd need for repairs. "Place needs work," Martin said, looking around the house. "But the foundation's solid. Your grandfather built things to last." He paused, then added, "You planning to stay, or are you thinking about selling?" It was the question I'd been asking myself since I arrived. The honest answer was that I didn't know. But standing there in that kitchen, surrounded by my grandfather's things and talking to a man who'd known him, something inside me shifted. "I think I want to try," I said. "I don't know anything about farming, but I want to try." Martin smiled, a slow, approving expression. "That's all any of us can do, son. Try and keep trying. Tell you what, I'll come by tomorrow and we'll start making a plan. Get this place back on its feet, one step at a time." He left shortly after, promising to return in the morning. I stood on the porch and watched his truck disappear down the driveway, feeling less alone than I had in years. Maybe this place could become home. Maybe I could build something here that mattered. The next few weeks passed in a blur of hard work and discovery. Martin proved to be as good as his word, showing up every morning with coffee, advice, and the kind of patient teaching that only comes from decades of experience. He taught me how to assess the damage to the barn's roof, how to clear drainage ditches to prevent flooding, and how to identify which equipment might be salvageable and which was beyond saving. His wife Linda came by twice a week with home-cooked meals and a warmth that reminded me of the kindest house mothers at St. Catherine's, except genuine and without the institutional distance. Through Martin and Linda, I met other neighbors. There was old Mr. Kowalski, who ran the hardware store in town and insisted on giving me a discount on supplies once he learned I was Thomas Miller's grandson. There was Rachel Chen, a woman about my age who managed her family's orchard down the road and who offered to teach me about soil testing and crop rotation when I was ready. And there was Father Murphy from the town's Catholic church, who stopped by one afternoon just to introduce himself and let me know the church community was there if I ever needed anything. It was strange, this sense of belonging that came not from what I'd done, but simply from whose blood ran through my veins. In the evenings, after Martin left and the sun began its descent, I'd sit on the porch with my grandfather's journal and read his entries by lamplight. I learned about the year the drought nearly destroyed everything and how the community had come together to help each family survive. I read about the first time he held my mother as a newborn, his words filled with joy and fierce protective love. I discovered entries about his time in the war, brief and painful, words carefully chosen to contain memories too heavy to fully express. And I found scattered entries about me, moments when he'd wonder what I looked like, whether I was happy, if I'd ever forgive him for not finding me sooner. Those entries hurt to read, but they also healed something inside me I hadn't known was broken. One evening, about 3 weeks after my arrival, I was replacing boards on the porch when I noticed something odd. One of the floorboards didn't quite match the others. It was slightly newer, less weathered, and when I stepped on it, it gave a hollow sound. I knelt down and pried it up carefully with a crowbar. Beneath the board was a small gap, and inside that gap was a metal lockbox, the kind you'd use for important documents. My heart raced as I lifted it out. The box was locked, but the key was taped to the bottom, wrapped in a piece of paper. I unfolded the paper and found another note in my grandfather's handwriting. "Danny, if you found this, it means you've stayed long enough to start making repairs. That tells me something about your character. Inside this box is $3,000 in cash, money I saved over the years. It's not a fortune, but it should be enough to get you through your first season and help you decide whether farming is really what you want. There's also a letter from your mother. I found it among her things after she left. I don't know if reading it will bring you peace or pain, but I believe you have a right to it. Whatever you decide to do with this place, know that I'm proud of you for trying. Your grandfather, Thomas." My hands shook as I opened the lockbox. Inside were neat stacks of $20 and $50 bills, exactly as he'd described. But my eyes went immediately to the envelope tucked beside the money. It was addressed to my grandfather, in handwriting I didn't recognize, feminine and looping. I sat there on the porch for a long time, just holding that envelope. Part of me wanted to tear it open immediately, and part of me was terrified of what it might say. Finally, as the last light faded from the sky, I carefully opened it. The letter inside was written on lined notebook paper, the kind with the ragged edge where it had been torn from a spiral binding. "Dad," it began, "I know I don't have the right to call you that anymore, not after everything I've done. I know you tried to help me, tried to save me from myself, and I threw it all away. The drugs, the lying, the stealing from you, I can't take any of it back. I'm writing this from a motel somewhere in Indiana. I don't even know what town. Everything's blurry now, everything except the one thing I need you to know. I had a baby, Dad, a boy. I named him Daniel, after your father. He's beautiful, perfect in every way. I'm not, and that's exactly why I can't keep him. I can't be what he needs. I can't even be what I need. I left him somewhere safe, somewhere they'll take care of him better than I ever could. I know you'll hate me for this, and you should. But please, if you ever find him, tell him I loved him. Tell him I wasn't strong enough to be his mother, but that doesn't mean he wasn't wanted. Tell him he deserves every good thing this world has to offer. I don't know if I'll ever get clean, Dad. I don't know if I'll survive this. But Danny will. He has to. He has your blood in him, and that means he's got a fighting chance. I'm sorry for everything. I'm sorry I broke your heart. I'm sorry I wasted the life you and Mom gave me. I love you, even though I've got a terrible way of showing it. Sarah." I read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down my face that I didn't bother to wipe away. My mother had loved me. In her own broken, desperate way, she'd loved me enough to let me go. She hadn't abandoned me out of cruelty or indifference. She'd done it because she knew she was drowning and couldn't bear to pull me under with her. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. I tucked it into my grandfather's journal, between the pages where he'd written about the day I was born. Then I took the money from the lockbox and carried it inside, placing it in the kitchen drawer where I'd been keeping important papers. $3,000. Enough to fix the barn roof, repair the tractor, buy seeds for a spring planting. Enough to turn this place from a relic into something living again. The next morning, Martin arrived to find me already up and working, tearing rotten boards off the side of the barn. He raised an eyebrow but didn't comment, just grabbed a hammer and started helping. "You seem different today," he finally said after we'd worked in silence for a while. I thought about my grandfather's letter, my mother's confession, and the weight that had lifted from my chest when I'd finally understood the truth. "I think I finally figured out why I'm here," I said. Martin nodded slowly, a knowing look in his eyes. "Good. That's the first real step toward making something of this place." We worked through the morning, and for the first time since arriving, I felt like I wasn't just surviving or passing time. I was building something. Not just repairing an old farm, but constructing a life that was mine. A life rooted in soil and sweat and the legacy of people who'd loved me even when I didn't know they existed. By afternoon, Rachel stopped by with information about a government program for new farmers that offered training and small grants. Mr. Kowalski dropped off some extra lumber he claimed he'd been meaning to get rid of anyway. And Linda brought fresh bread and an offer to help me clean the inside of the house whenever I was ready. I stood in the yard as the sun set that evening, surrounded by people who'd become something like family, looking at a farm that was slowly coming back to life, and I realized that leaving the orphanage hadn't led me to the streets or to loneliness. It had led me home. Spring arrived with a fury of green that seemed to explode overnight. The fields that had been brown and dormant suddenly burst into life, wildflowers carpeting the areas I hadn't yet cleared, and trees leafing out in shades of lime and emerald. Martin had helped me get the old tractor running, a process that took 2 full weekends and involved more cursing than I'd ever heard from the man. But when that engine finally turned over and rumbled to life, we both stood there grinning like idiots. With the tractor operational and the $3,000 my grandfather had left me, I was able to start actually farming. Martin suggested I start small, just 10 acres of soybeans to begin with, something relatively easy for a beginner. Rachel helped me test the soil and showed me how to read the results, explaining pH levels and nutrient content in a way that actually made sense. Mr. Kowalski sold me seeds at cost, and Father Murphy organized a group of volunteers from the church to help me prepare the field for planting. I'd never experienced anything like it. People I barely knew spending their Saturdays helping me disc and harrow the soil, showing me how to calibrate the planter, teaching me to drive straight rows. They brought lunch, shared stories, and treated me like I'd always been part of their community. The day we planted those first seeds, I stood at the edge of the field as the sun set, looking at the fresh-turned earth, and felt something profound settle in my chest. This wasn't just dirt and seeds. This was faith. Faith that if I did the work, tended the crop, and trusted the process, something would grow. It was a kind of faith I'd never had access to before, the faith that comes from having something to invest in, something that depended on me. Over the following weeks I fell into a rhythm. Wake before dawn, check the fields, make repairs, learn everything I could from Martin and the other farmers. The work was backbreaking, and there were days I wanted to quit. Days when my muscles screamed and my hands bled from blisters. But I kept going because quitting meant going back to having nothing, and I'd spent enough of my life with nothing. One evening in late April, I was sitting on the porch going through more of my grandfather's papers when I found a faded deed tucked into the back of his journal. It was for a small plot of land in the town cemetery, 2 plots, actually, side by side. One had my grandmother's name engraved on the headstone according to the paperwork. The other was blank, reserved for my grandfather. I realized with a start that I'd never visited his grave. The next morning, I drove into town and found the cemetery on the north edge of Milbrook. It was a peaceful place, old oak trees providing shade over neat rows of headstones. I found my grandparents' plots near the back, beneath a large maple tree. My grandmother's stone was simple, elegant. Margaret Ann Miller, 1931 to 1979, beloved wife and mother. Next to it was my grandfather's. Thomas William Miller, 1929 to 2023, loving father and grandfather. Someone had been maintaining the graves. The grass was trimmed, and there were fresh flowers in the holders, daffodils and tulips. I later learned that Linda had been tending them, a kindness she'd never mentioned. I stood there for a long time, not really knowing what to say. Finally, I just started talking, telling him about the farm, about the planting, about the people who'd helped me. I told him I'd found his letters, read his journal, and discovered the truth about my mother. I told him I understood why he couldn't reach me before, and that I forgave him, even though there was nothing to forgive. And I told him I was going to make the farm work, that I was going to honor the legacy he'd left me. The words came easier than I expected, and when I finally stopped talking, I felt lighter. I visited the cemetery once a week after that, usually on Sunday mornings before the day got busy. I'd update my grandfather on the farm's progress, share my frustrations and victories, and sometimes just sit in silence, feeling connected to something larger than myself. By June, the soybean plants were knee-high, healthy and green, stretching in straight rows across the field. Martin said they looked good, better than he'd expected for a first-timer. Rachel said the same, adding that I had a natural instinct for reading the plants, knowing when something was off. I didn't know about instinct, but I knew I cared. Every morning I walked those rows, checking for pests, monitoring moisture, pulling the occasional weed. I'd invested everything I had into those 10 acres, not just money, but hope. As harvest season approached, Martin helped me arrange to rent a combine from a larger farm nearby. He taught me how to operate it, how to judge when the beans were ready, and how to avoid the dozens of mistakes that could ruin a crop at the last minute. When we finally harvested in late September, I stood at the edge of the field, watching the combine roll through, gathering up the fruits of 6 months of labor. The yield was modest, about 40 bushels per acre, which Martin said was decent for first-year ground and a rookie farmer. But to me it was a miracle. I'd put seeds in the ground, and the earth had given me back something real, something valuable. The money from that first harvest wasn't much after expenses, but it was enough to prove I could do this. More importantly, it was enough to plan for the next season. I spent the fall and winter making more repairs, expanding my knowledge, and slowly transforming the farm from a neglected relic into a working operation. On my 19th birthday, exactly 1 year after leaving St. Catherine's, I stood on the porch of my grandfather's house, my house, and looked out over the land. The barn had a new roof, the fence lines were repaired, the fields were ready for spring planting, and I had a plan, not just for the next season, but for the next 5 years, the next 10. I thought about the scared 18-year-old kid who'd stepped off the Greyhound bus in Milbrook, expecting nothing, carrying nothing but a duffel bag and $200. That kid had been lost, untethered, invisible. But he'd found something here in the soil, in the work, in the community. He'd found roots. I pulled out my mother's letter, which I now kept in my wallet, and read it one more time. She'd been right about one thing. I did have my grandfather's blood in me, and that had given me a fighting chance. But I'd also learned something she maybe never had. Sometimes the family you're born into and the family you build aren't different things. Sometimes they're part of the same story, threads woven together across time and distance, waiting for someone to pick them up and continue the pattern. I folded the letter carefully and put it away. Then I walked down the porch steps and out toward the barn, ready to start another day of work. Because that's what you do when you finally find your place in the world. You work, you build, you stay. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If it touched you in any way, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to this channel and become part of our community. So many of us are searching for where we belong, and sharing these stories reminds us we're not alone in that search. Drop a comment below and tell me, what did this story teach you? Have you ever found home in an unexpected place? Or maybe you're still searching. Whatever your story is, I'd love to hear it. This community is built on shared experiences and the courage to keep moving forward, even when the path isn't clear. Hit that subscribe button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and I'll see you in the next story. Keep faith, keep building, and remember, you're never as lost as you think you are.